A city sentenced to starve. In September 1941, German Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Hitler's directive was chillingly clear in captured documents: no surrender, no negotiations, only encirclement and starvation. The former imperial capital, cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, was to be erased without expending shells on street fighting. Military archives show how German staff maps, annotated with supply depots and rail lines, treated the city as a logistical equation: cut the rail from the south, mine Lake Ladoga to the east, pound the remaining food warehouses with artillery. Inside the ring, however, the real front line was manned by women, librarians, canteen workers, tram conductors, archivists. Soviet records reveal that by late 1941, women constituted the majority of remaining municipal staff. On paper, they were non-combatants. In reality, they were the thin, freezing membrane between order and total collapse. And one of the most decisive battles was not fought with rifles, but with books. The librarian who refused to close the book. At the Leningrad Public Library, today's Russian National Library, Director Margarita Rudamino faced an impossible order: cut staff, close reading rooms, save coal. Her personal notes, preserved in the library's archive, trace the dilemma: heating pipes frozen, windows blown out by blast waves, staff fainting from hunger. Yet, she argued before the city's party committee, closing the library would be the capitulation of the spirit. Military censors quietly agreed. Political officers needed historical atlases, German texts, and engineering manuals for the defense. Thus, reading rooms stayed open, though readers arrived in padded coats and fur hats, ink freezing in inkwells. Women librarians shifted from cataloging Pushkin first editions to drafting bibliographic lists for tank engineers and artillery officers, summarizing in Russian what few could still read in German. The library, once a temple of culture, became a weapons factory of ideas. But its most important weapon would soon prove to be memory itself. Defending the city's memory under fire. When German artillery began systematically targeting Leningrad's food warehouses, the Badaev depots burned on 8 to 10 September 1941, archivists realized that paper, too, could vanish overnight. In the Central State Archive, many of whose employees were women, emergency protocols were drafted by candlelight: select the irreplaceable, move it underground, disguise storage as residential basements. Their choices, documented in evacuation lists, reveal a strategy as coldly rational as any general's. Census books and factory plans mattered for post-war reconstruction. Party files were politically vital, but so were Pushkin manuscripts and city plans, symbols of continuity that could stiffen morale. Transport was primitive: handcarts and children's sleds. One female archivist later recalled dragging a chest of 18th century documents through knee-deep snow under bombardment, knowing each stop to catch her breath increased the risk of losing 3 centuries of history to a single shell. While frontline units traded artillery duels, these women fought time, frost, and malnutrition. Bread, rations, and the arithmetic of survival. The true dictator inside Leningrad was not Stalin or Zhukov but the ration card. After the Badaev fire, grain stocks plummeted. By November 1941, official rations fell to 250 grams of bread per day for workers, and just 125 grams, damp, adulterated with cellulose and sawdust, for dependents. City Executive Committee minutes, now declassified, show the brutal calculus: who would get enough to walk to work, who would quietly die at home. Women dominated the bread queues. Many had husbands at the front or in mass graves. Some, like canteen worker Nina Kovaleva, kept hidden notebooks recording every gram saved, every rule bent to feed a child or an elderly neighbor. This was logistics reduced to kitchen scale, yet it fed the city's remaining factories and anti-aircraft batteries. Each furtive extra crust was an unauthorized supply operation. But to move more than crumbs, Leningrad needed a road that did not yet exist, over water that was not yet ice. Women on the road of life. Lake Ladoga became Leningrad's only artery. In late 1941, as temperatures plunged, engineers and officers of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts planned what German intelligence dismissed as madness: a truck route over a freezing lake. Soviet documents call it the Vladiga Ice Road, civilians called it the Road of Life. Women were integral at every stage. Female meteorologists in unheated huts measured ice thickness and wind speed. Their coded reports guided columns of ZS-5 trucks, often driven by girls barely 20, through blizzards and Luftwaffe attacks. Nurses and volunteers, many from Komsomol youth brigades, unloaded flour and ammunition, then reloaded the same trucks with skeletal children and the sick for evacuation east. Technical reports describe constant improvisation, chains on tires, improvised reflector poles, convoy spacing to reduce the risk of mass drownings when shells shattered the ice. Every successful crossing was a tactical victory in a supply war. Yet the city's weakest link remained within its frozen streets, its workers. Factories run on hunger. Behind the front, Leningrad's factories, Kirov plant, Obakov works, small machine shops, were ordered to keep producing shells, mortars, and tank parts. With most men at the front, production rosters show women making up to 70 to 80% of the remaining workforce. Many were former clerks, students, or housewives who had never touched a lathe. Now, in workshops where windows were taped against blast and temperatures hovered below freezing, they machined gun barrels with fingers numb from frost and malnutrition. Archival production reports reveal an astonishing pattern. Output dipped in December 1941, then rose again in early 1942 even as caloric intake fell, evidence of both coercion and grim determination. Engineers rewrote manuals so semi-trained workers could operate equipment. Women devised shortcuts, preheating metal with improvised braziers, cannibalizing broken machines, to squeeze out one more artillery piece. These guns would defend the city, but defending the spirit fell to different hands. Music against mortars. On August 9, 1942, the Leningrad Philharmonic Hall hosted an event that Soviet propaganda later mythologized but which diaries confirm as deeply real, the performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. While the composer himself was evaluated, the orchestra inside the besieged city was rebuilt under conductor Karl Eliasberg from whoever could still hold an instrument. Many were women, violinists, cellists, flutists, summoned back from frontline bands, factories, or hospitals. Rehearsal notes describe musicians fainting from hunger, walking miles on swollen, frostbitten feet because tram lines had stopped. The Red Army even planned an artillery counterprelude, hammering German batteries to silence them during the concert. Military coordination orders show how this cultural act became a combined arms operation. The performance was broadcast by loudspeaker toward German lines. POW interrogations later recorded soldiers calling it the music that said the city would not die. Yet for many in the audience, the true miracle lay simply in surviving long enough to attend. The silent tram conductors. Even as utilities collapsed, Leningrad's leadership insisted some trams continued to run, both to move workers and to signal that the city still lived. Passenger logs and transport directives from 1942 show drastically reduced routes, but they ran, often with only a few cars per day. The conductors and drivers were overwhelmingly women. They worked wrapped in blankets over their uniforms, scraping ice from windows with bare hands, sometimes stepping out between air raids to repair torn trolley wires themselves. Tickets, ration cards, and identity papers became intertwined instruments of control and survival. Conductors checked them with the authority of minor officers, directing scarce movement to where it mattered most: factories, hospitals, water points. In memoirs, several recall the macabre normality of pushing aside bodies frozen in their seats at the end of a shift. Their trams were mobile lifelines, but the most fragile lifeline in Leningrad was paper-thin, literally. Keeping the city thinking. Beyond the Grand Public Library, a network of small district libraries and reading rooms, many staffed entirely by women, stayed open throughout the siege. Their circulation records show two parallel wars: on one shelf, technical manuals and handbooks on first aid, explosives, and German language; on another, Tolstoy, Pushkin, children's fairy tales. City propaganda departments explicitly tasked librarians with curating psychological ammunition, books that encouraged endurance and discipline. Readers requested novels about earlier Russian hardships, 1812, the Civil War, Arctic exploration. Librarians, some too weak to stand, assembled portable collections for hospitals and anti-aircraft units, delivering books on sleds past shell craters. One wrote that poetry readings in air raid shelters calmed panic more effectively than political speeches. This was information warfare at the level of the human nervous system, controlling fear, channeling anger, preserving a sense of continuity. Yet no book could cushion the next winter's greatest enemy, cold. Firefighters in a frozen city. When temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, water in hydrants and hoses froze solid. Still, German incendiary bombs and artillery set wooden roofs and fuel depots ablaze. Fire brigades, heavily female by 1942 according to personnel rosters, fought these blazes with shovels, sand, and sometimes bare hands. Training manuals were rewritten to adapt peacetime fire tactics to block-by-block bombardment. Crews dug fire breaks, pre-dismantled wooden sheds, and soaked attics whenever a barrage was expected. Women hauled sandbags up dark stairwells, lungs burning from smoke and cold. One report describes a brigade that spent 10 hours on a single burning warehouse roof, sharing one gas mask between them. By dawn, all were half-conscious from smoke inhalation, but the fire was contained, saving adjacent food stores. Their work rarely made newsreels, yet without them, what little remained of Leningrad's housing and supplies would have vanished. The city endured, but the price was written in dwindling ration records. The mathematics of starvation. By the winter of 1941-42, Leningrad's medical institutes, largely staffed by women, had become laboratories of starvation. Doctors and nurses at the Institute of Nutrition, themselves emaciated, kept meticulous charts of edema, muscle wasting, and cognitive decline. Their research notebooks, preserved in post-war archives, record body weights dropping below 30 kilograms, pulse rates sinking, yet also note how a few extra grams of fat or malt extract could briefly restore strength. This was not clinical curiosity but desperate triage. Understanding starvation meant deciding who could still work, who could still fight, who might survive evacuation along the road of life. Improvised treatment protocols, adding cottonseed cake to bread, boiling leather for gelatin, were as much logistical experiments as medical ones, squeezing calories out of an imploding supply system. Nurses in unheated wards rationed not just morphine and bandages, but every spoonful of soup. Yet the most ruthless calculations unfolded in the city's kitchens. Kitchens at the front line. Communal canteens, stolovayas, became miniature command posts of survival, often run by women whose peacetime job had been feeding schoolchildren or factory workers. Now, with ration norms slashed and ingredients adulterated, they faced impossible orders: stretch a barrel of thin cabbage soup over 3 shifts of laborers, ensure no theft, keep morale politically sound. Canteen logs show how menus turned into alchemical lists: bread, 60% grain, remainder cellulose, husks, malt, cutlets, and reality made of soy, bran, and ground acorns. Yet memoirs also reveal quiet rebellions: ladles dipped a little too deep for a pregnant woman, crusts slipped to the pocket of a boy running messages for the party committee. In these rooms, propaganda posters of heroic workers shared wall space with calorie charts and hygiene warnings. The women at the stoves practiced a sort of tactical cooking, deploying limited fats and proteins to keep key workers just above collapse. Meanwhile, beyond their walls, a different battle for the future was being fought in classrooms. Classrooms under shellfire. Against all rational odds, schools in Leningrad reopened intermittently during the siege. Educational department files from 1942 show that about 70% of teachers still at their posts were women, many profoundly underweight, some living in the very classrooms where they taught. The curriculum was reshaped into a blend of basic literacy, war propaganda, and practical survival skills: how to recognize types of shells, how to render first aid, how to conserve heat. Children traced arithmetic problems while windows rattled from nearby explosions, chalk froze to the blackboard, pupils wrote in pencil stubs because ink congealed. Teachers doubled as social workers, tracking which children had lost parents, quietly petitioning local Soviets for extra rations for orphans. Their classrooms functioned as information hubs, relaying news from the front and rumors from the road of life. By keeping even a skeletal school system running, these women preserved the idea that there would be a future Russia to inherit the city they were defending. Covert voices on the airwaves. While most radios in Leningrad were disabled or requisitioned, a skeleton broadcasting service continued to operate from bunkers and improvised studios. Women announcers, their voices later preserved on brittle recordings, became the city's constant companions. Schedules from 1941 to 43 show a mix of official communiques, music, and letters from the front read aloud to bridge the gap between frontline and home. But hidden between the lines was intelligence work, coded references alerting partisans outside the ring, signals to coordinate convoy timings on Lake Ladoga, subtle indications of which districts had survived the night's bombardment. Technicians, many of them young women trained in pre-war radio clubs, patched equipment cannibalized from civilian sets, improvising aerials from bed frames and telephone wire. German intercept units, poring over recordings, noted the broadcast's unbroken regularity and misread it as evidence of abundant power and resources. In reality, a few exhausted operators and announcers, running on crumbs and willpower, were sustaining the illusion of a city that would not fall. Yet even they could not escape the darkest winter. The winter of the dead houses. By early 1942, diaries and NKVD reports alike speak of dead houses, apartment blocks where almost every resident had perished. Women municipal workers were often the ones sent to inventory these silent buildings. Sanitation brigades, armed with lists and cloth masks, moved from flat to flat, recording names, collecting documents, and arranging mass burials in frozen ground at Piskaryovskoye Cemetery. One inspector's report describes stepping over stacks of books and children's toys to reach a body by the stove. Another notes ration cards lying unused on a table, their owners dead before they could claim the meager bread. These grim surveys had a strategic purpose. Accurate population figures were essential to rebalancing rations and planning further evacuations. In effect, women clerks and inspectors became field demographers of catastrophe, translating personal tragedies into tables and totals. From this nadir, however, the siege began, slowly, unevenly, to tilt. The city's defenders, at the front and in the archives, were preparing for a long-awaited shift from endurance to counterattack. Planning for a city that might not survive. Even at the worst of the siege, planners in Leningrad's municipal and regional committees, many of them female economists and engineers, were drafting scenarios for both survival and total loss. Declassified planning memoranda from 1942 to 43 include chilling tables labeled "in case of complete depopulation," outlining how factories, bridges, and power plants might be restored after an occupation that, in reality, never came. Side by side with these were optimistic plans for post-war housing, schooling, and transport. Women in these offices worked with population figures that changed monthly, recalculating how many children might need schools in 5 years, how many widows would require pensions, how many hospital beds should be preserved. Their spreadsheets of the future were a form of resistance. Every projection of post-war tram lines or library branches asserted that Leningrad would exist to use them. At the same time, far from these drafting tables, other women were helping to shape the very operations that would lift the siege. Intelligence in the shadows. Behind the artillery duels and tank battles, women served as couriers, code clerks, and analysts in the intelligence services of the Leningrad and Fokhov fronts. NKVD and Red Army files, opened in part after the Soviet collapse, reveal female radio operators in forward posts transcribing German traffic through numb fingers, often under direct shelling. In the besieged city itself, some librarians and archivists quietly doubled as information filters. Their language skills and familiarity with German texts made them valuable for assessing captured documents, maps, and manuals. Others, posing as ordinary workers, monitored German propaganda leaflets dropped over Leningrad and reported on their themes and impact. Partisan detachments operating in the forests south of the city relied heavily on female scouts to reconnoiter rail lines and supply depots. Their handwritten route sketches later appear in operational plans for the offensives that would crack the blockade. These shadows of the siege, hard to romanticize and harder to document, fed directly into the moment when Leningrad's defenders finally took the initiative. From blockade to breakthrough. January 1943 brought Iskra, Operation Spark, the offensive that opened a narrow land corridor to the city. Official histories focus on generals and male infantrymen of the Leningrad and Fokhov fronts, but support roles list thousands of women in artillery supply, field hospitals, and communications. Along the Neva's ice, female medics dragged wounded soldiers back under fire, sometimes using sleds like those that had once hauled archives and children across Lake Ladoga. In field kitchens only a few kilometers from German lines, cooks, often older women deemed unfit for frontline combat, prepared hot food that soldiers later recalled as a turning point in morale after months of starvation rations. Within Leningrad, women at power stations and tram depots had kept enough infrastructure alive that, once the rail link was restored, trains could roll in within days. Breaking the blockade did not end the siege. Full relief would come only in January 1944, but it transformed the city's war from sheer survival to determined participation in a wider counteroffensive. And it sharpened a new question: when the guns fell silent, how would this story be told? Remembering, forgetting, rewriting. Post-war Leningrad erected monuments, issued medals, and produced films about the hero city, but the gendered reality of its defense was often blurred. Propaganda favored images of stoic mothers and grieving widows rather than overworked engineers or librarians with frostbitten hands. Yet the archives tell another story. Personnel files confirm that women formed majorities in crucial services: transport, food distribution, medical care, archives, and cultural institutions. In the 1960s and 70s, a wave of memoirs by female survivors, teachers, tram conductors, nurses, archivists, began to contest the earlier narrative, stressing competence and agency over passive endurance. Historians now cross-reference these accounts with ration records, factory output graphs, and evacuation lists to reconstruct the siege as a system in which women were central nodes, not background figures. Still, some aspects of their labor remain understudied: the quiet ethical decisions about who would eat, whose manuscripts would be saved, which patients would receive the last available injections. The moral weight of these choices lingered long after the last barrage. Who guarded a city with a library card? Return to the opening riddle: who guarded a city with a library card? The answer is not a single heroine, but a collective, a network of women whose tools rarely looked like weapons. Library catalogs, radio scripts, ration ledgers, tram schedules, school registers, medical charts, and fire brigade plans formed an invisible fortification around Leningrad's crumbling brick and stone. These documents, and the women who created and maintained them, coordinated food, heat, information, and hope. They decided which facts, which lives, and which memories would cross the thin line between annihilation and survival. Military history tends to spotlight the visible front, the firing lines along the Neva, the tanks outside MGA, the artillery on the Pulkovo Heights. Yet the siege of Leningrad can also be read as a test of urban resilience, in which non-combatants used pens, stamps, and catalogs to keep a city functioning just enough for the soldiers to fight. To understand how Leningrad endured, we must read not only its battle maps, but also its library cards.